What if the Black Death had wiped out 90% of Europe? What if everything you know about modern civilization never existed? No Renaissance art, no Industrial Revolution, no democratic ideals, and maybe no United States of America. The 14th century Black Death was already one of the deadliest disasters in human history, killing up to 50% of Europe's population. But what if the plague had been far worse? What if it had wiped out 90% of Europe's people? How would the world have changed without the rise of Western power? This is not just a question of history, it's a question of our present. Let's travel into an alternate reality where Europe never recovered, and the entire trajectory of human civilization changed forever. Picture Europe in the 14th century, a patchwork of thriving cities, bustling markets, and towering cathedrals. But then, without warning, death sweeps through the continent like a black tide, silent and unstoppable. In our real history, the Black Death killed nearly half of Europe's population, shaking society to its core. But in this terrifying alternate timeline, the plague mutates into something even more monstrous. Airborne, faster spreading, and deadlier, wiping out 90% of Europe's population in just a few horrifying years. This wasn't just a health crisis. This was the apocalypse. Entire kingdoms would crumble overnight. Imagine the French monarchy, the Holy Roman Empire, and the English crown, all gone within months. Royal bloodlines that had ruled for centuries would vanish, leaving no one to claim the throne. Courts, castles, and parliaments would stand empty, overtaken by weeds and wild animals. The cities we know from history books, Paris, London, Rome, Venice, would become eerie ghost towns, their grand cathedrals echoing with nothing but the wind. Without people to maintain the streets, aqueducts would break down, flooding some areas and leaving others dry. Cobblestone streets would crack and decay, once proud homes collapsing into rubble. And nature? Nature would reclaim what man abandoned. Wolves and bears would hunt freely in the forests of France. Wild cattle and deer would graze the overgrown fields of England. Even the dogs and cats left behind would form feral packs, struggling to survive in this empty, silent world. Europe wouldn't just be depopulated, it would be overgrown, wild, and dangerous. Economically, Europe would collapse entirely. Feudalism, the entire social system built on kings, lords, and peasants, would disappear overnight. No lords to collect taxes, no peasants to work the fields, no knights to protect the villages. Trade routes, once humming with merchants carrying wool from England or spices from the East, would fall silent. Industries like glassmaking in Venice or wine production in Bordeaux would cease to exist, their artisans dead or fled. Even basic necessities like bread and salt would become precious rarities. Religious life would collapse just as quickly. In our timeline, the Catholic Church lost nearly half its clergy, shaking people's faith in God's mercy. But in this alternate world, where 90% perish, the Church itself would nearly disappear. Entire monastic orders would vanish, bishops would be gone, and the Pope himself, isolated in Avignon or Rome, might die alone, leaving no successor. With no spiritual guidance, survivors would face an unbearable question: how could God allow this? Some might abandon faith entirely, falling into hopelessness. Others might return to ancient pagan beliefs, form desperate cults, or invent new religions in an attempt to explain the chaos. But who would be left in this wasteland? Not many. Maybe isolated farmers living in remote valleys. Perhaps a few monks holed up in mountain monasteries. Small fishing villages on the coasts of Scandinavia or isolated hamlets in the Alps might survive simply because they were too remote for the plague to reach quickly. But even these survivors would be scattered, struggling to find others, cut off from trade and culture. Without cities, universities would vanish. The intellectual centers of the medieval world, Bologna, Oxford, Paris, would cease to function. Libraries would burn, scrolls would rot, and the written word might all but disappear. Latin, once the universal language of learning, would be forgotten in favor of local dialects and oral traditions. The survivors wouldn't rebuild Rome or Athens. They wouldn't even remember them. They'd form small tribal communities, living off the land and fending off wolves in the ruins of cathedrals and castles. Europe would resemble something out of a post-apocalyptic movie, scattered tribes wandering through the crumbling remains of a civilization they could no longer understand. And while Europe fell silent, the rest of the world would notice. Trade partners from the Islamic world, the Mongol Khanates, and the rising Ming dynasty in China would send emissaries and find only empty ports and deserted markets. What would they think? Would they claim these lands for themselves, or leave Europe to rot as a cautionary tale? The stage was set. Europe, once the rising power of the world, was gone. Its culture, its power, and its influence erased in a matter of years. But history abhors a vacuum. When one great power falls, another rises to take its place. So, who would step in to fill the void left by Europe's collapse? The answer would shape the future of the entire planet, while Europe lay silent beneath layers of dust and overgrown forests. The rest of the world would be forced to decide: ignore the void or expand into it. And history tells us that when power collapses in one place, others rise to take its place. In this alternate world, it would be the civilizations of the Islamic world and Asia who stepped up to fill the gap, forever changing the balance of global power. At the time of the Black Death, the Islamic world was already one of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth. Stretching from the Atlantic coast of North Africa to the heart of Central Asia, it boasted powerful caliphates, wealthy sultanates, and vibrant trade hubs. Cities like Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad were bustling centers of learning, home to libraries, universities, and some of the world's most advanced thinkers in medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. In our timeline, much of Europe's Renaissance was sparked by rediscovering Greek and Roman texts preserved by Islamic scholars. But what if Europe never recovered to read those texts? In this new world, Islamic scholars would no longer be sharing knowledge. They'd be expanding it. Medicine would advance in the hospitals of Cairo. Astronomy would reach new heights in the observatories of Samarkand. New technologies, optics, chemistry, and mechanical engineering, would spread from Islamic Spain across Africa and Asia without waiting for Europe to catch up. Mediterranean trade, once dominated by Venetian and Genoese merchants, would shift southward. North African traders from Tunis, Tripoli, and Algiers would control the seas, ferrying goods from Asia and Africa into what remained of Europe's abandoned ports. Spice and silk routes would link East Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia, creating a vast interconnected economic network where Europe played little or no role. And while the Islamic world expanded westward, the East would surge forward as well. By the mid-14th century, the Mongol Empire, though fragmented, still controlled vast stretches of the Silk Road. This network of trade and cultural exchange connected China, Central Asia, Persia, and the Middle East. In this alternate timeline, without the threat of European expansion, the Mongols could consolidate their hold on Eurasia, transforming their empire from a military force into a cultural and economic powerhouse. Cities like Karakoram and Samarkand would flourish, connecting trade between East and West. Then there was China. In our reality, the Ming dynasty rose to power shortly after the Black Death, ushering in a new era of prosperity. But in this alternate world, the Ming dynasty would face no European rivals in the race for exploration and expansion. With their advanced shipbuilding and navigational technology, Chinese fleets could explore and colonize the Indian Ocean and beyond centuries before Portuguese explorers like Vasco da Gama ever set sail. Imagine Admiral Zheng He's treasure fleets not just visiting Africa, but establishing permanent Chinese trade colonies in East Africa and Arabia. Perhaps Chinese merchants would control ports like Zanzibar and Aden, creating a Chinese-Indian-African trade network spanning 3 continents. They might even sail further west, their ships reaching the isolated shores of the Americas long before Columbus was ever born. Meanwhile, India, diverse, piety, space, populous, and rich in natural resources, would not be far behind. In our timeline, the Mughal Empire rose in the 16th century to become one of the most powerful empires in history. But without European interference in the spice trade, the Mughal emperors might look westward instead of merely consolidating their hold on the Indian subcontinent. Imagine Mughal trade fleets docking in the Red Sea, Indian merchants controlling commerce in East Africa, or Mughal armies marching into a fractured Middle East to fill the power vacuum left by Europe's collapse. All these forces, Islamic, Chinese, Indian, and Mongol, would compete for influence across Eurasia and Africa, creating a multipolar world long before the concept ever reached Europe. And in this competition, innovation would thrive. Gunpowder weapons, paper currency, advanced mathematics, and sophisticated engineering would spread along these trade routes. But unlike our timeline, where these innovations filtered through European interpretation, they would evolve in distinct ways shaped by Islamic philosophy, Chinese Confucianism, and Indian spirituality. The scientific method, industrial processes, and technological advancements might take very different paths. But what about the Americas? In our timeline, it was European explorers who first crossed the Atlantic and changed the fate of two continents. Without Europe, the Americas would remain isolated for centuries longer. Civilizations like the Aztecs, Maya, and Inca could continue to develop independently, reaching new heights of culture, architecture, and astronomy. Eventually, though, the Old World would come calling. Perhaps it would be Chinese treasure fleets sailing eastward, establishing trade with the Inca Empire along the Pacific coast, or Arab navigators, following ocean currents from West Africa to the Caribbean, bringing Islam to the native peoples of the Americas. Or maybe Indian merchants, blown off course, would find themselves in the Amazon basin, establishing remote trading posts. In this alternate world, the so-called Age of Discovery wouldn't belong to Europe. It would be driven by Asian and Islamic powers, each carving out their own spheres of influence in a still mysterious world. Yet, with all this expansion and innovation, a question looms in the background. How long could this dominance last without a rival power like Europe forcing competition? Would these empires grow stagnant in their success, like many great civilizations before them? Would they fall into complacency, bureaucracy, and decay without an external threat to challenge them? Human history teaches us that without competition, stagnation often follows. Sooner or later, new powers rise and old empires fall. In this world, would it be China, India, or the Islamic caliphates that drive humanity forward? Or would the world splinter into regional powers, each holding their own piece of the global puzzle, never uniting into the interconnected modern world we know today? And so, as Asia and the Islamic world thrive, the question remains, would the spark of innovation and progress that once burned in Europe ever be reignited elsewhere? Let's face it, Europe's rebirth after the Black Death didn't just shape Europe. It shaped the modern world. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution laid the foundation for everything from your smartphone to the idea that people have fundamental human rights. But what happens if Europe never rises again? If the Black Death wipes out 90% of the population, that spark never catches fire, and the world we know simply never exists. In our reality, the Black Death created labor shortages that shook the rigid social hierarchy of medieval Europe. Suddenly, peasants were valuable. Workers could demand better pay. Serfs could leave their lords and move to the cities. Feudalism cracked, and with it, the old world order began to crumble. This social mobility eventually fueled intellectual curiosity and individual freedom, the perfect ingredients for the Renaissance. This alternate Earth would be dominated not by Western democracies, but by Asian dynasties and Islamic empires, with cultures rooted in tradition and stability, rather than disruption and change. The global conversation would be conducted in Arabic, Mandarin, and Hindi, not English, French, or Spanish. And yet, despite these differences, human curiosity, ambition, and creativity would still burn. Somewhere, someone would still look up at the stars and dream of reaching them. But without Europe's turbulent rise, that dream would unfold at a very different pace and in a very different world. In our next part, we'll explore the most important question of all. Without Europe's influence, would our most cherished values, freedom, equality, and human dignity, ever emerge at all? The modern world didn't just inherit Europe's technology and trade routes, it inherited its values. Democracy, human rights, the separation of church and state, freedom of speech. These ideas form the core of modern Western civilization. But in a world where the Black Death wiped out 90% of Europe, leaving no Renaissance, no Enlightenment, and no Industrial Revolution, what happens to those values? Do they ever emerge? Or does the world remain something fundamentally different from the one we know? To answer this, we have to look at the other great civilizations of the time. The Islamic world, for example, during its golden age, was a beacon of scientific learning and philosophical inquiry. Scholars in Baghdad's House of Wisdom translated Greek philosophy, developed algebra, and pioneered medicine. Islamic thinkers debated ethics, law, and governance centuries before similar debates reached Europe. In China, Confucianism emphasized order, education, and moral leadership. Civil service exams opened paths to government for the educated, regardless of family background. China had already invented paper, gunpowder, and the compass, technological marvels far ahead of Europe at the time. India, with its rich spiritual traditions, developed ideas of compassion, justice, and nonviolence. Buddhist and Hindu thinkers pondered the nature of suffering, karma, and the moral obligations of rulers toward their subjects. But there's a crucial difference. While these civilizations valued learning and stability, they also prized hierarchy and tradition. Power flowed from emperors, caliphs, and kings down to their subjects. Religion was not separated from the state. In many cases, it was the very source of law and legitimacy. Innovation often served the purpose of reinforcing social order, not challenging it. Without the Renaissance questioning the authority of the Church, without the Enlightenment challenging the divine right of kings, it's unlikely that the radical Western idea of secular governance, a government separate from religion and divine authority, would emerge in the same way. Without Europe's revolutions of thought, we might not have the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the U.S. Constitution, or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Instead, humanity might live in a world where emperors and sultans rule by decree and where freedom is granted by rulers, not inherent to individuals. And what about the idea of equality? In Europe, thinkers like John Locke and Rousseau argued that all men are created equal, at least in theory. In much of Asia and the Islamic world, societies were built on strict social hierarchies, caste systems, class divisions, and religious elites. Without an ideological challenge to these systems, they might persist far longer, leaving little room for social mobility or universal education. Culture, too, would be unrecognizable. No Beethoven symphonies, no Shakespearean tragedies, no novels from Mark Twain or Ernest Hemingway. Instead, humanity's cultural icons would come from the courts of Cairo, the studios of Beijing, or the libraries of Delhi. Our movies, too, would tell different stories. Hollywood wouldn't exist. Instead, the global entertainment industry might be centered in Cairo, with epic dramas drawn from Islamic poetry, in Beijing, with historical sagas of Chinese dynasties, or in Delhi, with spiritual tales from Hindu epics. The universal language of film, literature, and music wouldn't be English. It might be Arabic, Mandarin, or Sanskrit. Even the ways we understand ourselves, as free individuals with rights and personal agency, would be profoundly different. In this world, a person's identity might be shaped more by duty to family, ruler, and religion, rather than personal ambition or individual freedom. So, where would you fit in this world? If you're imagining yourself as one of the ruling elite, life might seem stable and comfortable, but for the vast majority of people, life in this alternate reality would likely be one of obedience, tradition, and limited opportunity. Your education, your career, Even your marriage could be dictated by social class and religious authority. Would you be free to speak your mind? Would you be able to question your leaders, protest injustice, or vote in an election? Probably not. Freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, these would not be universal rights, but privileges granted, or denied, by those in power. Even safety and peace wouldn't be guaranteed. Empires rise and fall, borders shift, and rival dynasties clash for control. Without the balancing forces of democratic governance and international human rights, wars could be brutal and unchecked. Justice could be arbitrary, and progress could stall for centuries. The death of Europe wouldn't just erase nations from the map. It would erase ideas from our minds, ideas that took centuries to develop, and even longer to spread across the world. And yet, human beings have always dreamed of something better. Somewhere, in some forgotten village of this alternate Earth, a philosopher might still question authority. A poet might still dream of freedom. A scientist might still wonder what lies beyond the stars. Progress would still be possible. It would just take longer, much longer. So as you sit in your modern home, watching this video on a device powered by electricity, protected by laws granting you freedom of speech and religion, ask yourself this. In a world without Europe's Renaissance, Reformation, and Enlightenment, would your life be better or worse? Would we eventually find our way to freedom and equality, or would we be trapped in cycles of empire and obedience forever? That's the question history leaves us with. Because the story of human civilization is not inevitable. It's fragile, and it could have been very, very different. So now that you've traveled with us through this alternate timeline, where Europe never recovered, where Asia and the Islamic world shaped the future, and where freedom and democracy might never have been born, what do you think? Would this world have been a peaceful global network of trade and culture, or a stagnant patchwork of empires and obedience? Would humanity still have found a path to the stars, or would we still be navigating by candlelight, centuries behind where we are today? How different would your life be in this world? Would your family have had the freedom to speak their minds, to practice their beliefs, to dream big dreams? Or would they have lived and died under the shadow of emperors, caliphs, and kings? Now it's your turn to imagine. Tell us in the comments, do you think human freedom is inevitable, or was it a historical accident? What other alternate history scenarios should we explore next? If this video opened your mind to new possibilities, share it with your friends, your classmates, your coworkers. Let's keep the conversation going, because history isn't just about what happened. It's about what could have happened. And most importantly, thank you for spending your time with us, diving deep into history's darkest corners and brightest possibilities. Until next time, keep asking the big questions. And remember, sometimes the scariest worlds are the ones that almost became reality.